Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a topic that's generated a lot of national attention and honestly some pretty strong feelings. Allegations of racial bias in residential real estate appraisals. We've got some fascinating sources, including a really detailed piece from a certified general real estate appraiser, someone with like over 20 years in the field, sharing his observations.
Yeah, his perspective is quite valuable here.
So our mission today is really to unpack these accusations, try to understand where this experienced appraiser is coming from, and look at all the different things that actually influence property values. Hopefully give you a clearer, maybe more nuanced picture.
It's a really important deep dive, I think, because like our sources show, this isn't just about house prices. It digs into economic imbalances, history, and even public trust in a whole profession.
Definitely.
We'll look at the claim, sure, but also the government's reaction and some of these, less obvious complexities in how valuations work.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The core issue. Over the last, say, 3-4 years, the appraisal profession has been under a pretty intense microscope.
Right.
Lots of accusations flying around about racial bias, specifically undervaluing properties in minority neighborhoods. It got so prominent that former President Biden mentioned it early in his term, talked about reforming the whole thing.
That's right. Back in 2021, President Biden launched the PAVE task force. That stands for the Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity.
PAVE.
Yeah, PAVE was a big multi-agency effort really designed to pinpoint and root out racial and ethnic bias in home valuations. Their action plan had things like, more fair housing training, better enforcement, trying to diversify the appraiser workforce itself.
Okay, so they put steps in place.
They did. But it's worth noting, come July 2025, some key PAVE policies were actually ended by the Trump administration. That said, the general effort to combat appraisal bias, well, that continues at federal and local levels. It hasn't just disappeared.
And these concerns, they often get fueled by specific cases, right? The ones that make headlines. Our source mentions some examples that sound pretty troubling at first glance.
Yeah, definitely.
Like borrowers trying to refinance, they get an appraisal back, they're not happy with it. Then they reportedly try this thing called whitewashing their home, taking down family pictures, changing decor, maybe having a white friend meet the second appraiser. And then that second appraisal comes back way higher. There was also the Shane Lanham case, which got a lot of press, though I understand that was later dismissed.
Exactly. These stories, especially the whitewashing one, they are jarring. I mean, huge reported differences in value. You can see why people get upset.
Absolutely.
But our appraiser source, the one with decades of experience, he really urges caution here, points out some critical details. In that whitewashing scenario, for instance, the first appraisal was apparently hired through an AMC, an appraisal management company.
An AMC?
Yeah.
Okay, remind us why that matters in this context.
Well, AMCs are basically middlemen between lenders and appraisers. And while they make things efficient, sometimes they tend to prioritize the cheapest, fastest appraiser they can find.
Ah, okay. Not necessarily the most local or most experienced.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Not always the most competent or the one who truly knows that specific neighborhood inside out. The source suggests this model itself might create openings for less accurate appraisals. Plus, that second appraisal, the higher one, it wasn't necessarily done for the exact same lending purpose.
So comparing them directly isn't straightforward.
Right. It makes a direct credibility comparison really difficult unless you have a formal professional review. And as far as the appraiser community knows, that kind of review wasn't publicly done or shared in that case.
Okay, so context is key. What about the homeowners suggesting different comps?
Yeah, that's another point the source raises. In that case, the owners apparently suggested using comparable sales from a totally different neighborhood market area that flies right in the face of basic appraisal principles.
The whole location, location, location idea.
Precisely. You need comps from the same or very similar competing market. And regarding the Shane Lanham case, yes, it got attention, but our source notes it was dismissed later. Mr. Lanham was found not at fault. So from this appraiser's view, these cases often highlight less about bias and more about a general misunderstanding of how appraisals actually work.
That's a really interesting shift in perspective. And it connects to that common idea, maybe a misconception, that, a house that looks the same in a mostly white area should be worth the same as one in a mostly black area. How does the appraiser's reality clash with that?
That's such a key question because it gets right to the core of what an appraiser's job is. They don't set the market value. They don't create it. They are reporters.
Analysts, reporters of the market.
Exactly. Their job is to observe and report how actual buyers and sellers are behaving, what they're willing to pay for similar properties in a very specific marketplace. If buyers and sellers aren't acting the same way or paying similar prices in two different neighborhoods, the appraiser cannot just pretend they are. They can't just grab a sale from a different market unless those markets are genuinely competing for the same pool of buyers.
So even if my house is identical in structure to one across town, if the neighborhoods have different market dynamics,
The values likely won't be identical, and a huge part of that, often overlooked, is the underlying land value. Think about Chicago, right? Land in Lincoln Park just isn't comparable in value to land in Pilsen or the West Side.
because the demand is different, the amenities, schools.
All of it. Different market conditions, different economic forces at play. An appraiser's job is to reflect those realities, the ones dictated by buyers and sellers, not to impose some external idea of what should be equal. They measure the market, they don't make it.
It really seems like the public often thinks appraisers have more power to set value than they actually do. So if they're market reporters, analysts, what does that look like in practice?
It means they're meant to be objective data crunchers for real estate. They give a credible, unbiased opinion of market value. How? By carefully comparing the most recent, most similar sales right there in the immediate area to the property they're appraising.
So it's not about counting bricks or liking the paint color.
Not at all. It's an analysis of market demand, of buyer and seller behavior. It absolutely cannot be legally and ethically an inference based on who lives there, their race, color, anything like that. Really, their main job is to be the one objective voice in a transaction, making sure the lender isn't lending too much and the borrower isn't borrowing too much based on what the market is actually doing.
That's a critical distinction. Like, they're the reality check in the deal. And this leads to another point our source made about value itself, this idea that cost doesn't always equal value.
Oh, absolutely. That's a big one. Homeowners often sink a lot of money into renovations, right?
Sure, kitchens, baths, additions.
Exactly. But it's crucial to understand that the cost of doing that work doesn't automatically mean the market value goes up by the same amount.
Can you give an example of these over-improvements? Like if I install gold-plated faucets, that cost a fortune.
Right. That's a classic potential over-improvement, or what appraisers call a superadequacy. Maybe you love the gold faucets, but will the typical buyer in your specific neighborhood pay extra for them? Probably not.
Ah,
Or think about putting a huge, expensive in-ground pool in a place with really cold winters. Or maybe a super high-end finished basement in a neighborhood of mostly modest homes. The market might not support the cost. Buyers might even see it as more maintenance or something they don't want.
so it's about what the market wants, not just what I spent.
Precisely. It's about demand. The source actually suggests, talking to an appraiser or a really market-savvy realtor before dropping big money on upgrades, just to get a sense of the likely return in your specific area.
Okay, so if appraisers are bound by ethics, focused on market data, and individual bias might be less of a driver than we think, what else is going on, particularly in some minority communities? This is where our source points to some potentially bigger issues.
Yes, and this is really important because it broadens the lens beyond just the appraiser. The source argues that in many areas, like parts of Chicago and its suburbs he knows well, other factors hit property values much harder than any single appraisal.
Like what? What are these bigger forces?
Well, first, he points to Cook County property tax assessments. It's not just that taxes are high, but that assessments can be disproportionately high, maybe even overassessed, particularly in lower-income areas or places without much political clout.
And that high tax burden drags down value.
It can, definitely. If people can't afford the taxes, it leads to financial strain, maybe foreclosures, and that puts downward pressure on the whole neighborhood's value. It makes the area less desirable or affordable.
Okay, so assessments are one piece. What else?
Property flipping, but not just regular flipping. He talks about predatory flipping.
Predatory. How so?
It involves agents and lenders targeting distressed properties, buying them really cheap, doing often superficial, quick cosmetic fixes, and then selling them for inflated, sky-high prices, as he puts it.
And the profit doesn't stay in the community?
Often no, it goes to the investors, the agents. But here's the ticker. Those inflated sales prices can sometimes lead to initially high appraisals for the new buyers, which then leads to higher tax assessments for them.
Oh, wow. So it sets the new buyer up for trouble.
Exactly. When there's an economic downturn, or even just normally, if the homeowner can't keep up with the mortgage plus those high tax escrow payments, it can spiral into foreclosures or short sales. It creates instability.
So the flipping creates these sort of artificial peaks, which then lead to damaging troughs and pull down surrounding values.
That's a good way to put it. He specifically mentions places like Country Club Hills, Park Forest, parts of Olympia Fields, Flossmoor in Illinois, where high tax rates, maybe from poorly run local governments or these aggressive assessments, create serious inequities and just devalue whole neighborhoods. These things, he argues, are systemic issues that crush value way more broadly than a single appraisal report for a loan.
That paints a much more complex picture of interacting economic forces. So given all this complexity, what about the appraisers themselves, their ethics?
Yeah, the appraiser in our source is adamant about this. He says bias, racial, or any other kind has absolutely zero place in the profession, period.
And there are safeguards.
Yes, every appraiser in every single report signs what's essentially a no-bias certification. It's certification #17, technically. They formally state they have no personal interest or bias, and their analysis is not based on race, color, religion, sex, age, marital status, handicap, familial status, national origin, none of it.
So it's a sworn statement in every report.
It is. And think about it, an appraiser with years of experience, certifications. They risk their entire license, their livelihood, if they're found to be biased. He says in private groups with hundreds, even thousands of appraisers, the consensus against bias is unanimous. They see themselves as the objective party.
That's a strong stance. But he does concede there are problems within the profession, doesn't he? It's not all perfect.
No, definitely not. While he pushes back hard on bias being the main driver in most cases people hear about, he absolutely admits that competency is a real issue.
Competency. So like lack of skill or training.
Exactly. He estimates that in maybe 8 out of 10 cases where bias gets alleged, the root problem is actually appraiser competency, maybe poor training, sloppy analysis, not understanding the local market nuances well enough.
So mistakes get made, but they might be misinterpreted as bias.
That seems to be his argument. Things like using bad comparable sales, maybe too old, too far away, not similar enough, or maybe not adjusting properly for market conditions, or failing to really analyze what features drive value in that specific micro-market.
Right. Things that require skill and diligence.
Yes. And these mistakes, even if unintentional, can lead to valuations that feel unfair or wrong to a homeowner, especially if that homeowner is already sensitive to historical inequities. He stresses that many appraisers simply need better training and more rigorous analysis practices. He even mentions that he and colleagues have offered to review supposedly biased appraisals, sometimes for free for local task forces.
And haven't always been taken up on it.
Apparently sometimes met with resistance or dismissal, so there's definitely a call for improvement in skills and standards across the board.
Wow. This deep dive really shows, doesn't it, that this whole issue of property values and potential bias is, well, it's way more tangled than the headlines often suggest.
And it really is. You've got market dynamics, the specific role of the appraiser as more of a reporter, historical factors, and then these big systemic things like tax policies and flipping practices.
Yeah, it's a complex web.
It just underscores how important critical thinking is here. You have to look at all the players, the appraisers, analyzing the market, yes, but also the local government setting taxes, and ultimately the buyers and sellers whose actions create the market value in the first place.
What really sticks with me is that distinction of the appraiser as market reporter, not market maker, and seeing how things like tax assessments or flipping aren't separate issues, but deeply connected to neighborhood value. It challenges that simpler narrative.
Absolutely. And maybe for you, our listener, it leaves you with a question to chew on. Thinking beyond just individual intent or bias, how can communities start to really understand and maybe push back against those bigger systemic economic forces? You know, things like tax policies or maybe unregulated flipping. Are they unintentionally or maybe even intentionally feeding into property value inequities? And what role do we all have in demanding more transparency and fairness from all the different players involved?